Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Black and Brown in Europe So White podcast, hosted by me, Emmanuel Achiri, Shada Islam, and William Noah Glucraft. It's a space where we intend to explore identity, migration, race, politics, belonging across the European continent, but much of the world as well. I know what you're probably thinking. Another podcast. And you know what? Fair enough. We are not here to tell you that this podcast is better than others or that this is different from others, but we want to take you on a journey with us. A journey to unpack what it really means to be Black or brown in Europe. Because despite millions of us living here, why does it feel so white? We'll ground this podcast in European politics, but we'll also explore everyday life and culture through a racial justice and decolonial lens. We'll talk about policy and power, Europe's colonial continuities, everyday racism, food, relationships, social life, migration, and identity. Sometimes we'll use humor. Sometimes we might cry, and at other times we may laugh. Everything is on the table, even the uncomfortable conversations. But before we dive into all of that with you, we want you to get to know us, our journeys, our politics, and our lived experiences. And why this podcast? And why now? So let's get this rolling.
The European way of life and the trust of our citizens is being challenged in new ways.
A world without rules, and where the only law that seems to matter is that of the strongest, imperial ambitions are resurfacing.
The Riviera of the Middle East.
We came, we saw, we died.
The vast wealth of the world is being held by people like Mr. Gates.
Europe is a garden. Most of the rest of the world is a jungle.
This does not mean that protection has to be in the European Union only. You also can have protection in safe third countries.
Is there the political will to reach out across the divide and try and create a new world whereby the them and us is no longer the paradigm?
All right, Shada, let's start with you. Where are you based? Who are you? What is your politics? And why this podcast? And why now?
Right, Emmanuel. So seriously, I'm one of these troublemakers, and I've always been a troublemaker, constructive kind of troublemaker. First, when I was a journalist, which was for years and years. So I've been working on the European Union in all its different manifestations for over 35 years, right? So inside, outside, etc. And obviously, working on Europe means working on also its policies and realizing how many of these policies are actually embedded in colonialism and racism as well. So for me, the defining moment, if you like, in my journey was 9/11. Until then, I was an exotic person working here, but there wasn't really any sort of obvious racism, visible racism as well. I was young, I'd been to university, but 9/11 changed all that because before that, been just a brown person, perhaps also an interesting brown person, but then I became a Muslim with a capital M. And that was the reason that I really woke up to what racism and Islamophobia were all about. 9/11 for me was very defining. So now I have my own company, and I write about race and colonialism. I write about EU geopolitics as well. And I'm really happy to start this podcast. It's something I've been dreaming about, frankly, for almost 2 years, if not 3. So it's wonderful to meet the two of you, Emmanuel, you and William. And so I'm going to turn to you, William, and tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you?
I ask myself that regularly. Who am I? Journalist, writer, kvetch. Like you, troublemaker, would never want to be part of a club that would have me as a member. One of my favorite Groucho Marx lines. I think it's true in so many ways. Deeply anti-authoritarian, maybe to a fault. Again, not wanting to be part of a club that would have me as a member. Even positions I agree with, I find myself fighting with myself. I find myself fighting with positions I agree with, just because I can never really be satisfied. It's interesting you mentioned 9/11. For me, I would say, first of all, the personal, the professional, and the political are all sort of mixed up in themselves. And sort of the three pillars of identity as an American, a born American, as a naturalized German, which then also makes me a naturalized European. And we're going to talk about what that even means to be European.
Yeah.
And then as a Jew. And these three things, I move through the world very conscious. And in the last 2 years, even more conscious of these three, that I move through the world on the shoulder of empire, as both an agent of that empire and a subject of that empire at the same time. And this deeply, deeply informs, like I said, personally how I move through this world, but also professionally, the kind of journalism I do, the kind of topics that interest me, looking at sort of the demise of our beloved liberal world order to the extent that it ever even existed or existed for some of us, maybe not all of us. And in the last 2 years, since the 7th of October, 2023, almost seeing as an individual and as part of the larger collective, my racialization or re-racialization happening in real time, and understanding for the first time in my life, actually feeling othered. Being able to, for most of my life as an American with someone who has white skin, being able to move through the world, and with someone with a name like William, total waspy name, being able to move through the world quite carefree. And not only in the last 2 years, but certainly accelerated in the last 2 years, understanding, oh, that's actually not so true if you don't buy into certain political power dynamics. If you're not going to carry the water of those power dynamics, then maybe you're not allowed to be part of that white power structure that you were told that you get to be elevated to. So it's very complex. It's also fascinating, and it's also tragic, because with me in those thinking is always the understanding that the cost and the sacrifice of this realization for me is at least 70,000 Palestinians in Gaza. And that's something that I carry with me every moment of the day, that, my sort of intellectual awakening, so to speak, great for me, right? But it's at a horrific human cost, done in my name that I never asked for. So I think the podcast, we're going to be breaking down a lot of the things I said. So I think, Emmanuel, I think I'm really interested in hearing more about you and what brings you to be sitting in this seat.
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of similarities, I think, in our personalities. And I think this is also what will make this podcast, quite interesting. I'm also really very anti-authoritarian. I consider myself an anarcho-communist. I don't believe in states. I don't believe in the structure of states. I think states are the forum through which capital and violence, capital is accumulated, but also violence is kind of legitimized. But I also consider myself a militant, a scholar activist. My journey to Europe has been a fascinating one. I was born in Cameroon. I prefer to identify myself as an African or as a Pan-Africanist, because I also don't believe in those borders that, the colonial powers imposed on us. I do understand the necessity these days in terms of interstate relations in Africa and trying to rebuild something, but at my core, I don't believe in those borders. So I consider myself a Pan-Africanist. I'm also a scholar. I write a lot on racial capitalism, on migration governance through the prism of racialization and decolonization. I try to dabble a little bit in non-academic writing. I try to write political sci-fis as well when I'm a bit stressed. And my particular journey to Europe, was really, from Cameroon, then to northern Cyprus, so the part that is under Turkish occupation and it's not recognized. And I was there for quite a while. And so I almost felt like I was at the border of Europe, looking into Europe. And then now, of course, moving to Brussels. And I think it's given me this unique perspective of really being outside of Europe as an African and having a completely different education. An education that allowed me to be very critical, of Europe and its coloniality, and then being at the border of Europe and seeing this duplicity in terms of, as a migrant, for instance, and seeing how migrants were treated, and then being inside Europe and confronted with the reality that this duplicity is not, it's actually intentional. This is not a mistake. This is by design. And so I think a lot of my my political views, of course, are kind of like, inspired by my upbringing. I was very radicalized, quite around the age of like 13. I was reading Das Kapital. I'm not a very big fan of Marx's days because he ignored, colonialism and its effect. But at 13, I was reading Das Kapital. And so like, I was radicalized, I think, very, very early. And this podcast, I think my inspiration, or how we actually got to this, I was thinking of doing a podcast. Shada was thinking of doing a podcast. And then we found ourselves in the same room, basically. And Shada was like, why don't we do this podcast together? Then we got to meet you, and you also, William, are into podcasts. And then I remember this day we sat and had this conversation in this coffee shop, and we're like, this is actually a podcast episode. The things we're talking about, our identities and stuff. And I'm really excited about this journey that we are going to embark on. I think there's a lot of similarities, but also there's different ways that we view the world and how we try to challenge power and coloniality. And I think this would make for great listening, great viewing, but also, also I think an enjoyable time for us as well.
Yeah, well, that is the purpose of it. So as you know, I am a journalist, right? I've been a journalist for most of my life. And it's been a fascinating journey as well, because, when there were these sort of dog whistles that we were hearing about how Europe was drifting further and further to the right. And I would say that today's Europe is so different, William and Emmanuel, from the Europe that I came to. I was 18 years old. And the story of Europe was really inspiring for me because, I was desperate to get away from this climate of animosity that we had between India and Pakistan. I was born in Pakistan. So coming here, Europe was a fascination. But it slowly, as you start sort of discovering the backstory, it's a fascinating backstory as well. But then you go further back to the imperial, to the colonizing part of it. And you realize that how many of the things that used to annoy me in Europe's relationship with Africa or Asia, Middle East, which I was following, went with delegations of commissioners to the Middle East, to Afghanistan, to, all parts of the world. And somewhere, somehow, they would say something that would give me really the creeps. And I would think, oh, why are we talking like this? And then, of course, it harks back to the way the colonization hierarchy was. So it's been a journey for me. I have to say it's been a kind of, I would say fascinating, but also it's been sad. Because, when you come here with a certain sort of impression of the EU and Europe and all of its sort of, and really it did speak to me. And then you realize, you start sort of, scraping off the bits on top, and you realize that there is darkness there, which some very good people have actually fought against and managed to overcome. And some of the things that Europe has done, frankly, I am still very impressed with it and inspired by it. But then there is, as I said, this dark side. And what I find, and I don't know how you feel about it, as I said, 9/11 was a very defining moment for me. And then, of course, William, like for you, Gaza was. And, we'd lived through just the pandemic, let's not forget. And during that
It's easy to, right?
Yeah.
So I think the world is in like collective denial.
Yeah. But even during the pandemic, you could hear those voices saying, of protectionism coming out, nationalism coming out, where the vaccine, in my sort of innocent, naive mind, the vaccine should be available to everybody at the same time, etc. And then there was this hoarding taking place within Europe. And then, of course, afterwards, there was the war in Ukraine. Russia's war in Ukraine. And then you saw this open distinction. All the masks fell, didn't they? The open distinction between, but these are white refugees. These are white asylum seekers. They look like us and they were welcome. Whereas I'd been writing about migration for 25 years and there's been nothing but racism and really hostility. And that's getting worse and worse. So it's been a journey of discovery, and some parts of it are really quite traumatic, I have to say, for someone like me. And now, of course, Emmanuel, when we talk about feminism as well, I'm a feminist, right? But I'm an intersectional feminist, right? And that concept also now is something that European feminists don't really want to talk about, So there is that sort of default feminism, which is white feminism, and which ignores
feminist foreign policy, as Annalena Baerbock would talk about, which supported bombing women in Gaza, right?
Yes, exactly. So Gaza was also a very important moment where all the rules, because I sort of believed, that the EU was a rules-based multilateral power. It said so. Many of its actions were, in fact, in favor of that, standing up for rules-based order when the first Trump administration was sort of taking a sledgehammer to everything. But on Gaza, from day one, it was so clear that this was just something that Islamophobia came into it, colonialism came into it, racism came into it, and basically double standards and hypocrisy came into it. And that for me has been, it's an ongoing trauma, I have to say, a wound. And I'm one of the few people, as you both know, in the mainstream, if you like, of Brussels So White, which still speaks and continues to speak about Gaza. Yeah. And the discomfort in the room when I do is palpable, So these are the reasons that we're here, right, guys? This is what we want to explore and expose.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you want to chip on, William, but it's quite interesting, that we have almost like different parcours, but then we get to the same point anyways, which is that Europe and its coloniality and its racism and its, imperialism. But I think my journey hasn't necessarily been from, there's, I don't want to say, I'm not trying to say that you had reverence, but this belief that, well, there is some good, the rules-based system, as you said, European values, the European way of life.
I didn't ever
okay, good to know.
Way of life is a dicey.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, okay, let me get it.
That's when the alarm bells go off.
Okay, fair enough. But my point was, I think my journey has been one of I know you, right? I know what you've done to my country, as European, as European states, because Cameroon was colonized by Germany first. Then by France and England, or was partition between France and England. And I'm so I've always been very conscious, of this. I was also very lucky to have very critical teachers, who very early exposed me to Frantz Fanon, the Amilcar Cabral. And so I really had your rules-based system doesn't fool me. I see through it. I see the asymmetrical relationships between Europe and Africa, whether it's in trade relations or the hundreds of coups in Africa from Lumumba and, and it spreads to Thomas Sankara and so on and so forth. There's also the Bamileke genocide in Cameroon, which happened at the same time with the Algerian, genocide. And these are things that, we grow up, we learn. And so we have this very, I think, political consciousness. But I think moving to Europe, what shocked me was I was like, yeah, I know you. But then I was amazed at the duplicity, especially around Ukraine, first and foremost. And because, again, as you mentioned, the vaccine, I wasn't surprised that, free vaccines were not given to African countries. And only when they were near expiration dates, and then, you Black people, you Africans, take this almost or nearly expired vaccine. So I wasn't surprised by that, because we know those things. But then I think with Ukraine, I was of course, I'm completely against any kind of military intervention. So this is not a justification for Russia's intervention. But I was so you are willing to take a stance against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, rightfully so. What are you doing about Congo? What are you doing about all these other countries that your companies are working with mercenaries? These are listed in UN documents. Why are you not having the same kind of reaction to, because it's the same, it's not the same lives as we know, but these are human lives that are being, people who are being killed. And then, with displacement from Ukraine, hearing European politicians say, these people are white, they have blue eyes.
They're like us.
They're like us.
Like us.
I was like, yeah, we know that, but come on, why would you even?
Which is funny, because anyone who knows the history of Ukraine knows the amount of Mongol influence and Muslim influence and Eastern Orthodox influence. And no, it's not like you. There is an incredible amount of diversity, even in a ostensibly white country.
Oh no, absolutely.
Right.
And I think that even now we see how this kind of openness towards Ukraine is changing. I know we are going to go into the topic of whiteness and differentiated whiteness, and dirty whiteness and so on and so forth. But to your point, it's even changing. You're seeing that it's changing. Like, oh, Ukrainians are no longer white enough. Like, hey, you've overstayed your welcome a bit. So like, yeah, they are kind of like, it's a spectrum of whiteness. But anyways, we'll get to that. But so it was like, this is really in your face. And then of course, like, Gaza and the genocide and the complete duplicity. I was like, you're not even trying. We know that the rules-based system has been a power-based system. It has been an imperial system, but at least there was this mask. And some people could argue, like, well, you know what? Yeah, maybe, European values, democracy, human rights, rule of law, and so on and so forth. But it's a complete disregard for Palestinian lives. And, it really amazes you. And I think it's not, of course, the death toll, that's the most shocking thing. But I also think it's the consequences of this. The consequence of this is like, of course, Palestinian lives, brown lives, black lives have never mattered. But I'm also just thinking like collectively, if you are a part of this very small elite capitalist class, your life doesn't matter. And I think the protests and how, the protests were handled by the police is a testament to how much violence we can expect in the future. Of course, black and brown people would always be the first to go, usually, but this violence would eventually, spread into European or to white people visualize.
For me, what I've seen in the last few years is just such a visceral boomerang effect. The violence and the oppression and the authoritarianism that has been exported for so long is coming back in such real, like it's almost. It's so literal.
It is.
Right? It's so literal. It's like no one's, as you say, no one's even pretending anymore.
No.
The violence on the streets of Minneapolis against, respectable middle class white, your neighbors. Again, they look like us, so to speak. That violence has been happening. I don't need to tell you. Around the world forever, and that all I'm seeing is this boomerang effect that's been theorized for 150 years.
Yes.
That I think that speaks to the masks falling a little bit.
Yeah, but why is it now? There is something happening in today's West or today's world, and it's not just Trump. Trump has accelerated all of these different journeys that we're on, but something has been happening, and I've been trying to figure out. For me, as I said, 9/11 was a moment where the masks fell, and when I realized that this was going to be a clash of civilizations in a way, right? Yeah. Because people would, my name gives it away, right? My name gives it away, and I would say I'm a secular Muslim, if there's such a thing, and I think there is such a thing. There are many, and people would not even know what a moderate, and then you had the good Muslim, the bad Muslim, the Muslim who was the terrorist, the integrated Muslim, and all of these things make me still very, very angry. And I think this, and we're going to talk about it. Who is European? Who has the right to be in Europe? What is the European identity? Is it value based? Is it civic, or is it based on, as Marco Rubio said the other day, white and Christian, right? So these are discussions that are going on all the time. And when I speak, what worries me is when I speak to young Muslims, right? Because a lot of the time I'm sort of asked to come and speak to them, give them career advice. And a lot of young Muslims, as we know, European Muslims, are quite anxious and quite actually inspired by the European Union and want to find jobs in the EU, Brussels, so white. They come to the parliament. They talk to parliamentarians. They're really interested in Europe. There is an interest in Europe. I agree with what you've said, Emmanuel, but I think a lot of people who are now in Europe want to be part of Europe. Critical, but part of Europe. They want to be in this journey that Europe is on. And my fear is that moment where a lot of people who were so-called outsiders and became insiders, all of this was conditional, right? And this is the moment where I think there is going to be a separation, because a lot of the young Muslims who I think are brilliant, setting up their own businesses, doing their own thing, really creating so much vibe in the cultural sector, all the rest, are leaving.
And that's what I find so interesting, because they're leaving. I lived in Germany for 15 years. I left Germany for reasons that we'll talk about. But exactly to your point, I find it's so interesting that there's still this very fixed idea of what Europe is, and there's a fixed idea of what not Europe is, what the West is and what the not West is. Yeah. But there's so much Europe in not Europe, and there's so much not Europe in very literal ways in terms of immigrant groups, but also just in ways of thinking in terms of class. I mean, when you leave the Euro bubble, the Brussels bubble here, and you go into the real city of Brussels, you're in the global South.
Absolutely.
Right? I live in the global South. Yeah. You know, the shops and the people and just the way people talk to each other and embrace each other and interact with each other. It's a completely different world, which I think is great, right? That's why I want to live in that world. But it really, when you're really living in it, you realize how ridiculous these sort of hard borderlines are. But at the same time, they do exist. Or they at least exist in a sort of a socialized, constructed manner. And it's something that I myself am trying to, I don't have an answer for it. I'm also trying to figure out where those lines are or where those gradations are. Because I always think about this time that I was in Tunisia, and I was looking at a map of Northern Africa and the Mediterranean, and looking at where Malta was, and looking at where Tunisia was, and looking at where Southern Italy was. Like, right. What is the difference here? Yeah. Actually, some of the best pasta I've ever had was in Tunisia because of all the Italian influence. So it's like, what is the difference? Like, why does this country get to be a good country and get to be in Europe, and this country is not? It really does. When you're on those peripheries, that's when you really start to see the absurdity, as you were saying, the absurdity of border and states, and where one sort of bleeds into another.
I mean, it was interesting when Morocco was asking to join the European Union, and there was like shockwaves across Europe saying, "What? How dare they? Don't they know? And don't they know what?" But no one ever said what. Turkey? Mm-hmm. I mean, Turkey's membership is now being discussed for what, 40, 50 years?
Yeah, something like that.
Right?
Yeah, literally.
Literally, yeah.
I think the Ottoman Empire will come back before and then it will absorb Europe.
But you know, the conversations I've had about Turkey with colleagues who I thought were progressive, liberal, boils down to no, they're not from our civilization.
Yeah, or they're in Asia.
Or they're Asia.
Or the European part of Turkey can be part of us, but the Asian part can't.
That is very interesting, because do you remember when Russia invaded Ukraine? There was a journalist who said, "Oh, but that's the Asian part of Russia. That is the Asian vibe of Russia. That is the Asian Russia that did it." I mean, yeah, Asia is supposed to be, you know, Oriental. And would say, thank you.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it boils down to whiteness, and we're going to talk about what whiteness, or how we try to, you know, understand what whiteness is. But I think that just looking at Europe, and we say Europe is a continent, like Europe is not a continent. Like
I have to correct people.
The Euro Mountains, like that's not the definition of a continent. So I think that even in Europe, or Europeans, or Western Northern Europeans, or whatever we consider as Europe today, even in how to self-identify as a continent speaks a lot. And what is it? What is the one thing that is common, at least in those, like, you know, in the European continent, quote unquote, is whiteness. And why is, like, you know, Asia, or, like, you know, part of Eurasia, because I mean all of this is Eurasia. Well, why is the other part not European? Even though it's just a mountain, like the Ural Mountains, I think, if I remember correctly, that separates that. Well, they are not white, and they are not Christian. And I think that is at the core, I think, you know, of like a lot of my writing, but reading, but also like how I try to, like, you know, approach my understanding of Europe. And of course, people are probably asking, like, oh, whiteness, what do they mean by whiteness? But, you know, at least how I think I see it, and a couple of others see it, whiteness is not just about skin color. It can be, but it's not just about skin color, because different groups can access whiteness, but not all groups, of course. But whiteness is power. Whiteness is basically, you know, it's of course, it's dynamic, it's shifting.
Yes, shifting, expanding, narrowing,
contracting. Yeah, but it's very durable, right? It's very, very strong and very durable. And it's a formation, it's a logic. It's like an assemblage of global coloniality, you know, that manifests, whether it's in supremacy, in capitalism, in racialization, in patriarchy, but also in disregard of the planet, of the life of the planet. Yeah. So it's really this position of power and authority that is, you know, or within this, you know, assemblage of power and authority, what we have, is coloniality, imperialism, and all of these manifestations of different forces. What is the kind of forces that we fight against? But that is the history of Europe. But that's also the today's Europe as well. And of course, I think we will try to go into a genealogy of how whiteness has come to be. And of course, I'm more than happy to have this conversation with you guys. But before we do that, maybe we still want to kind of I don't know.
I wanted to ask you, William.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll talk a little bit about what being brown means, right? Because being brown, brown is not a racial thing. It's also a social construct, but it's also geographical, right? So you can be brown. I'm originally from South Asia, Mediterranean, Southern Mediterranean. Biracial people are brown. South Americans are brown. All of Asia is brown. The Japanese were brown and now have become white. Once again, the Asian power, right? So I'm waiting for the Chinese to become white as well. Maybe the Indians will become white because they're
Anything's possible.
So but I think what's interesting in being brown is that there is this merger with Muslimness, with Islam. Yeah. So, South Americans are obviously not Muslim. Most of them aren't. But when in the streets of Europe, when they see brown people, I think the automatic assumption from the way they, look and speak maybe, or the dresses they wear, is that they are brown. But it's an interesting place to be because you're neither white, though a lot of, I have to say, Asians do sometimes think they're white. If you see the way certain classes of South Asians behave, the upper castes in South Asia behave very much as like white people do, very entitled, if you like, and you're not black. And in Africa, South Asians or people of Asian descent were really aligned and collaborators with the colonialists. Yeah. So that was an issue as well. And I think in my case, it's actually an issue of being, I think my surname says it all, and people automatically think that most Muslims are brown. And I've been having conversations with lovely people from the Balkans who are Muslim, but they're not brown, right? So if
they even deserved NATO's protection at one point, back in the 90s.
Or converts.
Yeah.
The lovely people who have converted to Islam and they're white as well. So when they're white, that's what's coming to you, William, everything is fine. The minute the same woman wears a headscarf as a sort of symbol of her identity, then she is a Muslim first and then a white person second. So what about you? Jewishness equals whiteness now?
Question mark? And we were talking about expanding and contracting. I think this is why I said earlier, real-time racialization. Racialization is a process that you think about as a historical process, but literally I've been able to feel it tangibly happen in real time. And I think, like you said, neither black nor white. It would, of course, be ridiculous for me to say that I'm not white. Look at me, right? That would be ridiculous, if not offensive, to try to claim that I'm something that's not white. But I'm also not white, and so I don't really know what I am, because I'm not going to support the power hierarchy of the global order, which Zionism has completely attached itself to. And if you're not, we've seen this. Again, my experience in Germany, Jews exist to uphold and support German power, right? The entire Staatsräson, the entire reason of state that Germany has for supporting Israel, it's not at all about actually compensating for crimes against Jews. It's not at all about Jews in the flesh and blood as real people. It's about excusing and dealing with the shame and finding a way to redeem oneself, which is ironically a very Christian idea, of German power, the German state, German establishment, using the Jew as sort of an archetype to cleanse themselves. So it's nothing about the Jews; it's about them. It's about themselves. And like I said, it's been an interesting and a very tragic devolution, I would say, of realizing, and I've spoken to Jewish friends of mine who roughly align with me politically and are equally appalled at what Israel has, again, and we should be very clear, they've been doing it for a lot longer than 2023. And it's very sad that a lot of people only woke up to this in 2023. For all of us, none of this is new. It's just, as you said about Trump, this is just an accelerant. But nonetheless, it is an accelerant, and everything has become so much more obvious. And the ironic thing is that Israel was founded, the whole idea of Zionism is to make Jews white. It's to make Jews be acceptable in the European eye. It's to civilize the Jews. It's to modernize the Jews as a nation in the same way as European states did to make people into nations. And ironically, what it's done is it's actually, for anyone who doesn't support that project, for any Jews that don't support that project, have actually been othered. Which is, it's just so ironic because it's supposed to be from a Zionist perspective, it's supposed to be an emancipatory project to free Jews from those shackles and to be independent and to be autonomous. And it's done anything but, if you're not willing to subject yourself to that imperial architecture. And again, I think it's always important because there's been a lot of mostly legitimate criticism of Jews in the last 2 years who have sort of centered themselves in the trauma they're going through of, Israel's not as nice as I thought it was, and it's not what I was told growing up, and this is a existential crisis for me. And there's been a lot of, I think, mostly fair criticism about that kind of centering. And I think it's important to understand that for me anyway, when I'm talking about Jewish racialization, that it's always in a dialectical conversation with Palestinian racialization, and that we can't understand what's happening to Palestinians if we don't understand what's happening to Jews, because in very different ways, of course, in very different ways, and in very different levels of severity, we're both subjects of this same kind of violence, or both subjects of the same kind of ideology. And I think when we start to understand that, we can actually open up new, and this is where I'm slightly hopeful, and I'm not a very hopeful person, but this is where I think we can open up new avenues of solidarity when we understand that we're actually all being kind of relegated to this off-whiteness or non-whiteness or outside the power structure in different ways, but we're struggling and suffering similarly. And I think that it's tragic that it takes that to require solidarity. But if solidarity is the result of that, at least something's come out of it. I've seen this. You've seen this in real time. And the example I gave about the Germans about using their history and their memory culture for their own ends, and we see that at the European level as well.
Absolutely.
And the amazing thing is that what the Nazis did is that they picked and chose and defined who and what was a Jew and what made a Jew. Europe's still doing it, right? Europe's still defining who and what is the good Jew, the bad Jew, who's the Jew serving me. And that's why it's always really important, because it's so easy to fall into anti-Semitic stereotypes about Israel pulling the strings and Israel controlling Europe. But it's actually the opposite. It's Europe using Israel and using Jews for their own political project. And that's why I think also connects very interestingly to the Ukrainian example. You said, yes, Ukrainians are white, and yes, they're getting a certain privilege because of that in terms of shelter and protection, but they're also being used for Europe's political purposes because it fits Europe, and here I'm really speaking about the European Union plus the UK, NATO, American kind of power projection in the world. It fits the political purpose of opposing Russia. So Ukrainians, yes, they're benefiting by their whiteness and they're benefiting from that protection that other groups are not getting, but they're also being used at the same time for political purposes to oppose Russia, which that just fits everyone's interests, right? And so I think there's a lot of connection there between the way Jews get used, the way Ukrainians get used, and other kind of groups of people who are in some way, shape, or form white. And I think that's some very interesting and troubling connections to look at.
So, Manuel, brownness, I said, is linked to Muslims, but also to migration, right?
Yeah, just maybe before that, I just want to, maybe...
Just a follow-up
question. A follow-up question. What about agency though? Like agency, because there's also, I think, a degree of agency. I mean, in Zionism, but in any other form of nationalism, whether it's Black nationalism or is it Hindutva? Hindutva, there's also some agency involved, right? It's again, I also make the argument that it's actually convenient for Europe what Israel is doing in Palestine, the genocide, and all of this, demonification of Jews, especially, those, not especially, but like all kinds of Jews, whether they are considered good ones or bad ones from the viewpoint of the EU, but like this serves the EU's purpose. It serves America's purpose. I mean, like Israel is a military outpost for the US in Southwest Asia. I mean, at least that's my position. But there's also a degree of agency.
I think it fits quite neatly into the history of imperialism, where we have many examples of subaltern groups using imperial power to better themselves. Right? I think the Jews in French Algeria is a classic example, where for very understandable reasons, I mean, especially at the individual level, you don't want to be a martyr. You want to have food on the table. You want to put your kids through school. You want to better yourself. And so it was much easier for the Algerian Jews to fall in line with French imperial power as their path, as their ticket to upward mobility and acceptance in society, and fighting their own battle of emancipation and assimilation, and screw over their Algerian neighbors who were Muslim. Yeah. And so I think there's a long history, and so there is agency there. You're absolutely right. I think it's there's never, I'm a big fan of dialectic. So there's never one without the other, right? There's always there's freedom. Freedom doesn't come without slavery and subjugation, and the Hegelian slave bondsman kind, or lord bondsman dialectic. There's always these things in competition with each other, and it's really complicated because you can be. It really puts into a complex question of the victims and the perpetrators, and you can take a snapshot of history, and in one moment there might be a group that's the victim, but that very quickly in another snapshot flips. So I absolutely agree with you. I think there's a long history of subjugated peoples finding ways to use their subjugation to find that agency to create some kind of alternative path.
And it suited Europe that this Jewish population was then have a homeland of its own. I mean, that was a very convenient thing for that as well. So many of their own anti-Semitic sentiments,
Yeah. And we saw that. I mean, that's historically documented. I mean, Zionists working with Jew haters and with Nazis because they serve both sides. And one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is why is Palestine so intractable? Because there's conflicts all over the world, and at some point, most conflicts in some way they don't get resolved, but there's progress. There's some kind of evolution, and the Palestine question really hasn't moved. It's actually just gotten worse. And I think for me, at a kind of very high level, there can never be an answer to the Palestine question because it would reopen the Jewish question, and Europe can never allow the Jewish question to be undone, because that would completely undermine European intellectual history. Right, that would be the end of European modernization.
Yeah, so the whole Judeo-Christian myth that has been created, right?
And being reinforced now, especially speaking of power, right? Marco Rubio, I mean, his idea of that civilization is Judeo-Christian.
Yes.
And that's why it's easy to deflect Christian anti-Semitism, because actually that's inconvenient. We need this to be together.
It was a very convenient concept that was developed, absolutely. Yeah. So, I was just saying that brownness also is linked to migration, right? Very much so. And that, I think, migration is, the battlefield where all of these different things we've been talking about, the colonial history, the imperial legacies, the racism, the whiteness, this sense of belonging, is I think all linked to the way Europeans deal with racialized migrants. I mean, whether they're brown migrants from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan.
Right? I'm never a migrant, right? Even though, of course, I am, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right?
So we've talked about brownness and Jewishness. Tell us a little bit about blackness, hypervisibility, and.
I mean, I think one thing which is fascinating for me is when we're thinking of a name for this podcast, we're black and brown, in Europe so white. I don't actually identify myself as a Black person. I identify myself as an African because Blackness is a racializing term. The same way as there's no people who are white or people who are brown. There's people who are racialized as white and of course with power, and there's people who are racialized as brown and as Black. But let's say for the sake of not wanting to go into technicalities, so let me.
That's the first thing we should have said about our podcast. We don't actually believe in Black and brown.
Yeah, true. But for the sake of also just ease of conversation. And again, because we are, playing, with racialization and the power dynamics. Yeah, Blackness is dialogically opposed to whiteness. Like in the spectrum, literally in the spectrum, you have whiteness, which is the power and everything that comes with it. And of course, also people who are racialized as white because they also are paler in skin. And then you have Blackness, which is like the complete and opposite. And I think what is also, I don't know whether fascinating is the right term, is even before, you have Africans being racialized as Black and as subhuman and as, in this state of non-being, is you have these racial classifications in Europe for a very long time, or at least proto-racial classifications, with Roma people, with Jewish people. I'm talking in medieval Europe. Roma people, Irish, Jewish people, the Slavs, the Sami people. So you have these proto-racial classifications in Europe. And of course, when Europeans started settling in what we consider today as the Americas, and the genocide and extermination of indigenous populations and the enslavement of Africans. Of course, there were revolts by Africans and by indigenous communities. And so then the notion of whiteness as an identity is created in the sense, and whiteness here equated to Europeanness. So all of these Portuguese, Irish, Spanish, English, French, German, what have you, who had been fighting in Europe, as Christians, Protestants, but also over their national identities, suddenly this became part of this synthetic political identity, which is associated to Europeanness and of course paleness and whiteness and power and everything, for the purpose of what? Owning slaves and benefiting from slaves. And so this notion of Blackness and equating it to non-being or to being a slave, actually that's where it comes from. And the whole point of that was really constructing this idea of non-being for certain groups of people, in this case, Africans and indigenous people. And that is why even today, when we talk of slave, the word slave, the first thing that comes into people's minds is Black people, because Blackness or Africanness was equated to slave and slave to Africanness. So they became really synonymous. And this is where this notion of Blackness comes from, or the racialization of Africans as Black, and also into subhumans, because again, slaves were considered as not human enough. We know all the caricatures that we use and all the pseudoscientific whatever BS that they use. And of course, this happened in the Americas and of course was exported to other parts of the globe through colonization of other parts and everything. And so you can literally see that everywhere you go on this earth, people who are racialized as Black are at the bottom of the pecking order, because you have whiteness here and you have Blackness. And then you have this, this spectrum of racialization that some people can get into the house of whiteness, the sacred house of whiteness, and of course sometimes kicked out. But the one group that never gets into this house of whiteness are people who are racialized as Black, because of this hypervisibility, but also because of this lasting construction of Black people as subhuman. And that's why you often see when people are trying to be racist. And again, this happened a couple of days in a football match. I think it was Real Madrid versus Benfica. As soon as a Black person or someone racialized as Black has a problem with someone from any, and this, by the way, was an Argentine player. So someone you can consider as white in a sense, but is still racialized. The first thing he started saying was monkey. And you could see people in the stadium as well, also making, primate gestures and slurs. And it still boils down again to this whole construction of Blackness, equating it to subhuman. And what do we consider as subhuman in this our, which is also problematic, this classification of species, is that Black people are equated to primates. So we are, in a sense, uh, underdeveloped humans in a sense. And this is still very much the case. And even when people don't use those slurs, you'd see other proxies that are being used. And again, this is where migration comes in. It's one of those proxies. Of course, for migration, it's not only Black people. Of course, it's brown people, but also Muslim people as well. I mean, people who are Muslim. And I think what is really kind of I don't want to say, because it's not fascinating. These things are really a bit hurtful, but it's to see really how even in today's world where you think that perhaps, we have grown as a collective society, you can really see that when it comes to Blackness, it's an identity which has, frozen in time. And no matter what you do as a Black person, unless, of course, when you kind of socialize up to power, or you become, a house Negro, that's a term that I can use, unless you're willing to sell yourself and your community. And even when you do, when push comes to shove, you always remind that you actually do not belong. And I think that this is one of the things with at least with those of us who are racialized as Black. It's almost as, of course, I don't agree with it. I completely reject it. But collectively, and again, especially in Europe, you can see how subtle it is, but how enduring, and in the same, it's subtle, but also really very visible. Especially when we're looking at migration governance, and people who are being stopped on the streets, and the latest thing report by the Fundamental Rights Agency showed that Black people were more likely to be stopped than any other community. And then, in fact, in another study on being Muslim in the EU, even among people who were visibly Muslim, Black Muslims were, disproportionately stopped more than other Muslims. So again, but we also see it as well within in Asia, but also in Northern Africa and in Southwest Asia, or what others refer to as Middle East. I prefer to refer to as Southwest Asia. Take for instance the Kafak system, where you have Africans who are used as basically as slaves, if we want to be honest, within Southwest Asia. These are people who are racialized. Or within Northern Africa, for instance, you see how Black Africans were being hunted in the streets of Tunisia or Algeria and down in the desert during COVID. In China, where there was a lot of violence towards Chinese people in much of Europe, but also in the US, or much of the West, you could say. So you could see this really racialization of Chinese people as this other people and stuff. Yeah. But even in China, you could see that Black migrants and students were being kicked out of their out of their hostels and their apartments, and told to go back to their countries. These were people who were also going through racialization. And so you see that even it's not only in what we consider as societies that are majorly racialized as white, but even in other communities where people are racialized themselves, you still have a lot of anti-Black racism or Afrophobia. And I think it's down again to this hypervisibility, but to this lasting construction of Africanist equals to slave equals to primate, monkey, and whatever, and it's stuck. And I think that no matter how much Africans have tried, Black people have tried to fight against, it's still just stuck. I mean, an example is Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was in Algeria during the Algerian War of Independence. He fought with Algerians. He wrote, he has a long history with Algeria. But even still then, in Algeria today, you see how Black-skinned Algerians, other Black Africans are treated. It's all of this memory of this connection during the decolonization period, or during the or what we consider decolonization period. I don't think there was any form of decolonization anyways, but all of that has been forgotten, and it's gone back almost to reset mode. Let's go back to reset mode, and to Africans being racialized as subhuman. And so maybe to summarize, it's kind of I would say, especially for me, how I see this is I don't accept it. I try to challenge it, but I'm also really very conscious of the position of Black people and Africans, or at least Africans who are racialized as Black in Europe, but also globally. And you know what is shocking? Is that even in Cameroon, even when we are like in places that are majorly Black or racialized as Black, you still see the racial classifications. Like you go into a bank and you were standing on the queue and a white person gets into the bank and the clerk says, please come to the front. Wow. And when you challenge it, they're like, he must be important. He must be serious. He must be in a hurry and stuff like that. And this also happens with people who are racialized as brown. So that tells you how deep this process of racializing Black people as always inferior, how it's also internalized within our community.
I was going to say it's internalized across the world because of colonialism, right?
Yes.
Because of the colonial mentality that has gone across. And the elites adopted that, right? Yes. But when you talk about this, Emmanuel, you have seen, and obviously you work for the European Network Against Racism. So there was an anti-racism action plan. So there was an awareness, a glimmer of awareness that we are all very conscious of in 2020 after the tragic death of George Floyd. The European Union woke up, or rather people like me forced it to wake up and recognize and acknowledge its own racism.
Which is itself an amazing understanding of racialization, that Europe, which has plenty of its own racism, needed the United States, which actually speaks a lot to Europe's own sort of coloniality in vis-a-vis the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it was a joke to see Europe suddenly, we should talk about racism because America's talking about racism.
Well, no, it wasn't as simple as that. They didn't want to talk about racism. They said it's an American problem. Yeah. Don't bring it into Europe. Yeah. Don't bring America's culture wars into there. I was following it very, very closely. And it's only when people like me started writing about it in the mainstream media saying, come on, what about our own racism? And voices like, Inar and myself, and the automatic reaction was, there was a commissioner for the European way of life who said, we're not racist. Our police is not racist.
That's what they said in Germany. We don't need to do a study on racism in the police because, quote, there is no racism in the police.
We have to, our next podcast or one of our next podcasts is going to be about police violence, ICE and Frontex. So we have to talk about that because this is something that's become really so crucial in our lives in terms of, when our kids go out, when there are demonstrations, Palestinian or Sudan or Congo, whatever happens. I mean, this is dehumanization of an entire part of Europe's citizens. We're European citizens. I mean,
in my case, I'm a resident.
You're a resident, but I am a citizen of Europe, and I demand my rights.
But you still have rights.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean they are conditioned.
In theory.
I mean, they are. I think even if you're racialized, citizen, resident, undocumented, irregular,
migrant.
You're migrant.
Oh, we're starting.
It's conditional.
Of course.
Your Europeanness is conditional.
We're seeing that in Palestine, where Palestinian Americans are getting killed by Israeli forces, and the U.S. government has nothing to say about it.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. This is right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we talked a lot about blackness. Do we need to talk more about whiteness?
No, I think.
Or we're at just a.
I was just going to say it's been an hour.
We're at 59 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. I think
we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. We have more episodes to do. We don't need to talk about everything in this episode.
Yes, I think let's take it step by step. We've talked about Europe.
Yeah.
And we've talked about ourselves and our lives here and our priorities as racialized. Yes. So I think let's leave the discussion about whiteness.
Yeah, that sounds great.
What makes you white or doesn't make you white?
Yeah.
For our next podcast.